So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kim Knowle-Zeller, pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church. I live in Cole Camp, Missouri. Been here a few times. It's always great to come on Sunday morning and to witness your faith and your presence and all the good work that God is doing in you. So thanks for being here. Thanks for being the church here and in the world. And so this is, I believe, the beginning of what Pastor Scott's sermon series. So I am starting off, is that correct? Okay, on this road, path to joy. And so being connected in joy. Let's hold on. The road to joy, and joy is living connected. Joy is living connected. And before we get to connection, I think I need to start at rest. Because for me, and I know the truth that I've learned is that we cannot be connected. We can't have a connection with others, with family, community, with God, with ourselves until we get time alone, until we're able to rest, to take Sabbath rest, to sit in God's presence. We need community to be able to be alone, and we need to be alone to be in community. Now, is it easy for you all to take some rest? Right. No, head shaking. So it's not for me. And a part of that is that we are so connected. Sometimes we're over-connected, hyper-connected, and that's not only through cell phones, which are a huge part of it, in social media, but we can be connected to here, to across the state, across the world, in the blink of an eye, in an instant. It's just so easy to be connected. And even if you don't have a phone or social media that sucks your time in, you have probably plenty in your life that keeps you busy. Perhaps it's the constant TV that's on in the background, or radio or music that you keep on, or maybe it's the constant need to check your email, to have the notification sounds beeping all the time, or maybe you obsessively clean or make sure things are in their place, no dishes left undone, no toys strewn on the floor. Perhaps you just need to make things perfect. Or perhaps you're just interested in acquiring more and more, whether that's money and fame and titles, more cars, more things to put on the resume, and more in our closets. Or perhaps just what's a symptom of where we are in our life right now is we're running and driving back and forth to everything, to volunteering, to church. You're going to be at this great big thing on July 4th, right? I bet that's taking a lot of time for people to make strawberry shortcake. Maybe it's school, work, volunteering, practices, back and forth, back and forth. There is not a shortage of things to keep us connected and busy. And so how do we stop? How do we hear those voices and the words in Scripture that tell us, come and rest, be still, come away with me, Jesus tells us in some of the Scriptures, and rest a while? So we're connected. But then also, I think before we can rest, there's another side. There's a flip side to this question too. Because we know that finding time to be is a challenge. But there's also the fact that sometimes we feel like there's a space inside of us that's too big, too lonely, too uncomfortable. Perhaps you know what it feels like to have a space, a hole in your heart after the death of a loved one or after hearing a diagnosis. Perhaps you wonder if that ache will ever go away. Perhaps it's hard to get up some mornings and to think about what the day will bring and to find any joy in where you will go and who you will encounter. Perhaps you know the depth of a broken relationship or addiction, and you're longing for reconciliation, and you're wondering how to move forward. Sometimes the holes within us are just so big. There's too much grief, too much worry, too much in the world that is telling us to look here and look there, and that weighs heavy on our hearts. So whether we're too connected or whether we have the space within us, we are still called to rest. We are still called to take a break from the bustle, from the activity, to have a chance to renew, to stop, to slow, an end of work, if only for a little while. An opportunity to stop doing so you can just be. And I think about resting, and I think about that famous psalm that you probably have heard, Psalm 23. It's that psalm that we hear in hospital rooms, at bedsides, at the funerals, at gravesides, and perhaps you also hear it at the bedside of your child at night. Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And perhaps we can hear it this way: because the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Because I trust God for my good, I shall not cave in to the loud din of my culture, enticing me to want and want and want at every turn and corner of my life. Because God has promised to take care of me, I will get off the treadmill of work and accumulation so that I can rest and notice the abundance and rejoice. The Lord is my shepherd. Come and rest. Come and rest is the first piece of being connected, because once we're rested, we then know what it is to have that peace and that joy that Jesus gives us, and then we are sent out. And I think about the text from the Gospels that's in a couple of the Gospels, the feeding of the 5,000, where the disciples have been following Jesus. They're listening to him teaching, to his preaching, to see his healing, and then the crowds have gathered, and they are hungry. All of the people who've been with Jesus, all the people who have come to hear him, they want something to eat. And Jesus says to his disciples in one account, "You, go feed them." And the disciples say, "With what? We're hungry too." And if you remember in the Gospel of John, where there's the same story of the feeding of the 5,000, there's the little boy, and it's the little boy that Jesus says, "See that little boy? He has some bread and he has some fish." And Jesus has the little boy bring him that bread and fish and feeds the abundance, the multitudes. They're fed. Jesus invites us to rest. He calls us to rest. He gives us rest. And then he feeds us. Jesus invites the disciples to feed others. And this is what we do. This is what we do as a church. We are fed so that we can feed others, so that we can be connected to this world that is hungry and hurting, that we can bring life to places where there is not life, to places where there is a need for hope and healing. So when we talk about rest, it's not just the time to come to worship. It's not just a Saturday afternoon, Sunday afternoon nap. It's not just meals with family. Sabbath and rest is always life-oriented. It's always life-giving. It's resting so that we can provide rest to others. It's about life and providing that same life for our neighbor. It's about being fed and nourished so that others know that same quench of hunger and thirst. And though perhaps right now you are feeling that you need to feel loved, perhaps maybe you need to be fed, and so sometimes this rest that comes to us, this rest that God gives us, is just that, sitting and basking in God's presence and Christ's light and knowing that you are loved. But then there's always a next. There's always a but. There's always more, because God is always calling us to be loved and then to share that love with others, to go out into the world, to feed, to bring hope and healing, to cross boundaries, to go to places where people are afraid to go, because that's where Christ meets us. That's where Christ connects us to our neighbor and to this larger body of Christ. And especially when we do feel lost or lonely, especially when we have those holes in our heart that won't go away, this is when we can then go out into the world, because those empty spaces, that grief, that loss, that loneliness, cannot be filled only by sadness, but it's filled by the grandness of God's love, the grandness of God's love in serving God's people. I've talked about this before, when I graduated college, I went a month later and spent 2 years in the Peace Corps in West Africa. And so if you had a daughter, a 21-year-old daughter going across the ocean, and technology was not as it was when I was in the Peace Corps, so I did have a cell phone, but there was no network. There's no connection where I lived. So I would schedule times to call my parents, and we wrote mostly by snail mail. So if you had a child in that situation, what would you want to tell them every time you talked to them or when you wrote them a letter? I love you. What else would you want to say? Miss you. Be safe. I'm sure my dad said that. But no joke, in every single letter that I have from my dad and in every phone call that we had, my dad would end and he would say, make sure you wear your boots. Make sure you wear your boots. And the truth be told is I very rarely wore these boots. And can you imagine what I said to my dad? Sure, Dad. Yes, Dad. So it was hot, so I wasn't going to wear boots. But my dad, in his mind, had this picture of me traipsing off into the bush where there are snakes and in the water where there's hippos. And so he was afraid for his daughter. And so he sent me what I now consider a blessing in his words and his voice every time we talked. Be sure to wear your boots. Because my dad, as a faithful person, knew that life is hard. That especially as a 21-year-old going off to a country that I didn't know the language or the people, I would be scared and afraid and lonely, and yet, I was still called to love. Still called to step outside of my hut and venture to meet people, to learn, to listen, and to share love. And that's what we do. People of the church, people of God, we are called, loved children of God who are fed, who are loved, who are beloved gifts to this world. And we're sent out to share that love with people who are on the margins, people who are on the border, people who are so unwilling to come through our doors. And so we share our love. We go out, we wear our boots because we have been rested, we have been fed, and we know that this world has so many broken and places in need of God's love. Amen.